weeks, and the monotony of trench life was broken only by the occasional skirmish. But then came the order for a night raid. The objective was to capture a German soldier for interrogation. James knew the risks, but he also knew the importance of the mission. Under the cover of darkness, James led a small group of men, including Tommy, across no man's land. The ground was slick with mud, and every step was a struggle. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the soft squelching of boots and the occasional rustle of equipment. They reached the enemy trench without incident, but as they prepared to descend, a flare lit up the sky. James froze, his heart in his throat. The Germans had spotted them. "Go! Go!" James shouted, leading the charge into the trench. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Bayonets clashed, and the air was filled with the sounds of grunts and screams. James found himself face to face with a German soldier, their rifles locked in a deadly struggle. With a surge of strength, James disarmed the man and knocked him unconscious. "We've got one!" James yelled, dragging the prisoner back. But as they retreated, a burst of machine gun fire cut through the night. Tommy cried out, clutching his side as he fell. "No!" James dropped the prisoner and rushed to Tommy's side. The young soldier's face was pale, his breathing shallow. James slung Tommy's arm over his shoulder and half carried, half dragged him back to their lines. The cost of war. Tommy survived the night, but the wound was severe. He was sent to a field hospital, and James never saw him again. The raid had been a success, but the cost weighed heavily on James. He had lost men before, but Tommy's youth and innocence made it harder to bear. As the war dragged on, James became hardened, his once bright eyes now dull with the weight of command. The trenches were a hellish existence, filled with lice, rats, and the constant threat of death. The men under his command looked to him for strength, and he gave it even when he felt none himself. One particularly brutal battle stood out in James's, a massive offensive, and the British lines were in danger of collapsing. James and his men were ordered to hold their position at all costs. The fighting was relentless. The ground churned into a bloody mud by the constant shelling. James stood in the trench, his rifle in hand, as wave after wave of German soldiers advanced. His men fought bravely, but the enemy was relentless. James felt a searing pain in his shoulder as a bullet grazed him, but he ignored it, focusing on the task at hand. "Hold the line!" James shouted, his voice hoarse. "For king and country." The battle raged for hours, but somehow they held. When the Germans finally retreated, the trench was littered with the dead and dying. James slumped against the wall, his body numb with exhaustion. He looked around at the few men who remained, their faces etched with the same weariness he felt. The end and the beginning. The war ended as suddenly as it had begun. The armistice was signed, and the guns fell silent. James returned to England, his body battered but intact. He was greeted as a hero, but the accolades felt hollow. The memories of the men he had lost, the horrors he had witnessed, haunted him. Eleanor and Margaret were waiting for him at the station, their faces filled with joy and relief. James hugged them tightly, tears streaming down his face. He had kept his promise, he had come home, but the war had changed him. The once confident officer was now a man burdened by guilt and sorrow. He struggled to adjust to civilian life, the nightmares keeping him awake at night. Eleanor stood by him, her love and patience a beacon of hope in the darkness. One day, as James sat in the garden watching Margaret play, he felt a sense of peace. The war had taken so much from him, but it had also given him a renewed appreciation for life. He knew the road to healing would be long, but he was determined to walk it. For James Aldridge, the war was over, but the battle within would continue. And yet, as he watched his daughter laugh, he knew that there was still hope, still a future worth fighting for.